Welcome back, everyone. This is the first video lecture that's going to cover Chapter 2, the chemical basis of life. So, depending on your background, this is going to be either pretty easy because you had it in the past, or if you haven't had any chemistry recently or not at all, you might have to spend a little more time on this chapter. Basically, this is a super basic review of chemistry that you should know in order to understand some concepts in anatomy and physiology. Typically, you take chemistry, starting in elementary school all the way up through high school. And you've probably covered all this at some point, but this hopefully is a little refresher. Also, I'm going to be connecting these things to topics in anatomy and physiology. So it's not just going to be chemistry. It's going to be, hopefully explain to you why do you need to know some of this chemistry for anatomy and physiology. So let's start by going over our chapter topics. First thing we're going to do is start really basic, learn about atoms. What is an atom? What are the common atoms in the human body? And a little bit about, what are some of these atoms, how are they going to play a role the rest of your A&P career. Subatomic particles, as the name suggests, these are smaller than an atom. So these are basically the building blocks to an atom. And again, you've probably heard of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So we're going to talk a little bit about these. Again, why are these important? We're going to see that protons determine pH. So the more protons you might have in a solution, the more acidic that solution is. We're going to learn that electrons play a role in forming bonds so you can make bigger molecules from the atoms. So we're going to talk a little bit about the subatomic particles. Chemical bonds is how we're going to make larger molecules. If you remember, an atom is kind of the smallest unit of matter, but you can put more than one atom together using chemical bonds, and now you have a larger molecule. Then we're going to talk about what we mean by polar versus nonpolar and hydrophilic versus hydrophobic. And this largely has to do with what kind of chemical bonds are within a molecule. So if a molecule has what we call polar covalent bonds, it's going to make that molecule polar. If the molecule has nonpolar covalent bonds, that molecule is nonpolar. And this determines whether that molecule will dissolve in water or it won't dissolve in water. And these are terms we use for that. So hydrophilic means you like water. Philic means you like it. Hydrophobic means you don't like water. So hydrophobic molecules are nonpolar, things like oil and fat and lipids. If you're hydrophilic and you like water, that's because you're polar, because water is polar. So this is usually a topic where, we want to, be careful. We want to pay attention closely so we can understand those concepts. We're going to talk about pH. This is very important for anatomy and physiology. We've mentioned before that, your blood has to be a certain pH. Others, secretions have a certain pH that's important, like stomach acid. That's a hydrochloric acid produced by your stomach, causes the pH to be very low and acidic. Your skin is fairly acidic. That helps reduce microbial growth on your skin. So pH comes up quite a bit in anatomy and physiology. Then we talk about types of molecules. Molecules can be classified as either inorganic or organic molecules. Basically, if you're organic, you have a lot of carbon and hydrogen bonded together. Those organic molecules would be things like carbohydrates and proteins and lipids. If you don't have a lot of carbon and hydrogen, you're considered an inorganic molecule, and you're usually pretty small. Inorganic molecules are things like sodium chloride or salt. So we really kind of finish up talking a lot about these organic molecules. This is probably the most important concept in this chapter. We need to understand and be able to, appreciate the difference in these four types of organic molecules, such as carbohydrates. We're going to hear about, molecules like sugars, like glucose and sucrose and lactose. There's also larger carbohydrates, such as glycogen and starch. Those are all types of carbohydrates. And then we learn what those are used for in the human body. Carbohydrates are largely where we get energy from. Lipids, so lipids are going to include things like your fats and oils, which are triglycerides. We'll also learn about cholesterol as a lipid, and steroids are lipids. Proteins do a lot of the work in your body, so they're going to be things like enzymes, and you might have structural proteins in the body. And then nucleic acids, those include DNA and RNA. So let's start with atoms and subatomic particles. So an atom is composed of subatomic particles. What makes atoms different are the numbers of all these subatomic particles. And every time you might have, another electron, it makes you, or another proton or another neutron, it makes you different. So there's a lot of different types of atoms based on different types or different combinations of neutrons, protons, and electrons. So atoms are the basic unit of matter. Neutrons have no charge to them. Protons have a positive charge, and electrons have a negative charge. So if you have equal numbers of protons and electrons, that atom will be neutral. If you don't, say for example you have one more electron than you do a proton, then you're going to be negatively charged. If you have one less electron or one more proton, you're going to be positively charged. So the combinations of protons and electrons might determine whether that atom has a charge to it. All right, so where are these things found in an atom? An atom has a nucleus. Now, this is not a nucleus of a cell, right? Cells have a nucleus, but so does an atom. And inside the nucleus is where you're going to find the protons and the neutrons. All right, so they're kind of balled up in the center of the atom. Around that nucleus is where you're going to find the electrons. And they kind of move around. So a lot of times we'll draw it something like this and call it an electron cloud. Sometimes we'll draw it as if they're in orbits, kind of like planets surrounding the sun. But this is kind of how we would draw an atom and where those subatomic particles would be. All right, so then what makes them different? Like I mentioned, it's the different numbers of protons, electrons, and neutrons. So that each element is uniquely defined by the number primarily of the protons it has. All right, so that's kind of what we follow when we look at different types of atoms. So for example, a hydrogen atom has 1 proton. A carbon atom has 6 protons. An oxygen atom has 8 protons. All right, and that is also what we call the atomic number. The atomic number is equal to the protons in each atom. And typically that's going to equal the number of electrons if that atom is neutral. The mass number, that has to do with the number of protons and the neutrons. Electrons have very, very, very little mass. So they don't really contribute to the overall mass of the atom. So we kind of neglect the electrons because they don't have much mass. So the mass number is just adding up the protons and the neutrons. So notice the hydrogen atom. So here's the nucleus. There's a proton in there. All right. Hydrogen actually doesn't have any neutrons. It's just a single proton and a single electron. All right. And that's what hydrogen is. If you look at carbon, right, kind of the magic number for carbon is 6. It's got 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and then it's got 6 electrons, or 6 electrons around it. Now notice this is kind of the orbiting way to model what an atom looks like. And then oxygen, the magic number is 8. It's got 8 of all those subatomic particles. Now, what I want to point out now, and we're going to get to this later, is electrons like to be paired up. All right, so notice that we've got these 2 electrons kind of paired up here. Over here we have one that's not paired up. Now that's going to be important when we start talking about covalent bonds. Atoms might want to, in order to pair up their electrons, they might share a pair of electrons. And that's what forms what's called a covalent bond. So electrons are really important in forming these covalent bonds that hold atoms together pretty tightly. But again, we'll come back to that. What are the kind of most important atoms or elements in the human body? This is a table. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot of anything from this table. But again, what it does, it's going to connect some of these elements to things we're going to get to further down the line. So we're mostly made up of oxygen. Notice that 65% of our body mass is oxygen, and that's largely due to water, right? H2O. We're mostly oxygen. We've got quite a bit of carbon, all right, because we're made up of a lot of organic molecules. We got quite a bit of hydrogen and nitrogen. So those are kind of the big 4. Those are what we would call the major elements based on, abundance. You'll notice that, obviously oxygen is going to be important not only for, being part of water, it's in a lot of our organic molecules, and obviously we breathe oxygen in order to utilize it during energy production. Carbon, again, organic molecules contain a lot of carbon. Hydrogen, again, part of water. Now notice here, we're going to get to pH in a little bit. Notice that when you have a hydrogen ion, that means that this hydrogen is positively charged. Now what happened to that atom is it lost an electron. So when hydrogen doesn't have an electron, all it is a proton, and we often call it H+ or a hydrogen ion. And the more of this you have, the more hydrogen ions or protons in a solution, the more acidic that solution is. All right, so we're going to come back to that concept. Nitrogen's in a lot of our protein and nucleic acids. And then these are kind of the minor elements, not because they're not important, it's just they're not a huge percentage of us, okay? So don't think of minor as being not important. Minor is just based on the abundance. But we're going to mention quite a bit of these. Calcium, obviously, when we get to teeth and bones. Also, it's very important in blood clotting when we get to that in AMP2. Muscle contraction we'll get to in AMP1, so we'll see how important calcium is there. But you can see, that a lot of these other elements we're going to talk about, whether we get to say water balance, we'll talk about sodium and chloride. When we get to blood and learn about hemoglobin, we're going to learn about the importance of iron being part of our hemoglobin, which helps us transport oxygen. So for now, don't go and memorize and try to learn all the significance of these elements. This is just to show you that one day we do talk about these in anatomy and physiology. All right, so we're going to talk about bonds. There's 3 major types of bonds. Again, a bond is how we're going to hold atoms together. Based on these bonds, we want to look at how they're formed, number 1. How strong they are. So are they very, very strong or are they weak bonds? And then, what kind of molecules might have these kinds of bonds? So the first one is ionic bonds. So an ionic bond is formed between ions. So we first have to learn what an ion is. An ion is an atom that does not have equal numbers of electrons and protons. So they're charged. All right, there's two types of ions. You're either a cation or an anion. Cations are positively charged because they lost an electron. All right, it's not because they gained a proton. It's because they've lost an electron. All right. Why did it lose an electron? Usually because that electron wasn't paired up. Okay, now notice sodium. Sodium is kind of the classic example of a cation. Here's sodium, Na is the symbol for sodium. Notice this atom here is unpaired, and it's all by itself out in this orbit. Well, that, I'm not going to get into, deep chemistry, but basically that makes that atom not very happy. So to make that atom happy, it just spits out that electron. It loses that electron, and now we've got all paired up electrons out here. Each electron has a little buddy, okay, which makes sodium happier. But it makes sodium positively charged. It's a cation. Anions have gained electrons. All right, now why would this atom want to gain an electron? Well, you'll notice there's the issue. We have an unpaired electron out here. So in order to make this orbit kind of full and happy, it's not going to lose an electron because you're still going to not be full, but instead it's going to gain an electron. So notice this electron gets taken up by the chloride, and that makes chloride now negatively charged. All right? Then it's just a matter of opposites attract. All right? So when you have a cation that's positively charged, an anion that's negatively charged, those opposite charges attract, and that forms an ionic bond. All right? And sodium and chloride bonded together is salt. All right? Sodium chloride, table salt. So that's an ionic bond, and we got ionic bonds between a lot of ions. Okay, calcium chloride is a calcium attracted to two chlorides. All right. Now, these are relatively weak. They're about the middle of the road as far as how strong the bond is. For example, when you put salt, right, imagine this is kind of a cube of salt. When you put that in water, all the little ionic bonds break, and that's what causes salt to dissolve in water. It breaks all those ionic bonds. So they're not that strong. If all you need is some water, and those bonds will break. All right, so that's ionic bonds. Let's look at covalent bonds. These are going to be the strongest of the three. And the key here is sharing of electrons. All right, so when you have two atoms, they can share. And again, that basically makes a paired up electron, and it makes them happy. So hydrogen bonds with hydrogen. All right, it's hydrogen gas. But notice an individual hydrogen atom has an unpaired single electron. So these two like to bond together because now they can share a pair of electrons. All right, and that bond between the two hydrogen atoms is called a covalent bond. What's that word mean? If you want to know where that word came from, the outer orbit of an atom is called the valence electrons, and they're sharing valence electrons. So covalent means the atoms are sharing electrons that are in their outer orbit or outer shell. All right. So you could have a single pair being shared. All right. Well, so if one pair of electrons is being shared, it's a single covalent bond. You could have two pairs, or basically four electrons being shared. That forms a double covalent bond. All right. Strongest of the bonds, the key word is sharing electrons. All right, so we have to take this a little bit farther. So covalent bonds, there's a couple different versions, and we'll get into that, on the next slide. But when you have carbon covalently bonded with hydrogen, that's the definition of an organic molecule. All right, so that's going to be carbohydrates, that's going to be proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. They're going to have a lot of hydrogens and carbons bonded together. All right, so for example, methane, which is a gas, that's an organic molecule because it has a lot of these carbon-hydrogen bonds. All right, and notice how this happened. So this carbon has 4 unpaired electrons. So it would love to just pair up these 4. Hydrogens have a single unpaired electron. So all you got to do is pop those hydrogens, and now you've got these sharing of electrons forming these 4 covalent bonds. All right. Down here we have water. So water is formed by covalent bonds. Same idea. You'll notice that hydrogen here is sharing a pair of electrons with the oxygen right here. Now, what's the difference here? The difference we're going to talk about on the next slide is sometimes there's equal sharing and sometimes there's unequal sharing. So in this situation, these pairs are being shared equally. So the electrons are kind of spending the same amount of time around the hydrogen as they do around the carbons. Here, when we get to water, the oxygen kind of pulls more of the electrons towards it. So the electrons spend more time around the oxygen, which makes that oxygen a little bit negatively charged. So this little symbol here, that little symbol is the Greek letter delta. All right, and it's used by chemists to show that it's not a full negative charge, it's a partial charge. So it's not an ion. Ions are full charges. The hydrogen is partially positive because that electron is staying over by the oxygen more. All right, so this bond here, when there's unequal sharing, is called a polar covalent bond. This bond here, when it's equal sharing, is called a nonpolar covalent bond. All right? Okay, so we just learned what organic molecules are. They have carbon and hydrogen. Inorganic molecules don't have carbons bonded to hydrogens. All right, so here's this slide. Again, this is an easy topic, so if you're struggling with chemistry, you're not alone. But let's kind of walk through it again, looking at these drawings to help us understand. So 2 types of covalent bonds. If you are nonpolar, you have equal sharing of electrons. So there isn't going to be any partial charges within that molecule. So an example, again, would be this hydrogen gas. So the electrons, notice that these colors here represent basically how long does the electron stay in that area. But it's equal. So the electron's going to be spending the same amount of time around this hydrogen, all right, as it does around this hydrogen. Non-polar. The word polar, if you think about what polar means, it's kind of like north and south poles, right? They're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, if you will, opposite ends of Earth. So when you have unequal sharing of electrons, what happens is one of the atoms becomes more electronegative, meaning that electron likes to spend more time around that atom. So here we're showing the bond between an oxygen and hydrogen. All right, for example, if it was in water. The electrons spend more time around oxygen. Notice how this red color represents more electrons. So it spends more time around this oxygen, which makes that oxygen partially negative. All right, not a full negative charge, but we call that a partial charge because it kind of pulls the electrons. The hydrogen becomes a little bit more positive because it got the electron pulled away from it. All right, so notice in this molecule, so this is showing water. We got oxygen here, there's its nucleus. Here are all its electrons out here. Here it's sharing a pair with hydrogen. But these electrons are getting pulled towards that oxygen, these electrons are getting pulled towards that oxygen. So oxygen becomes partially negative, the hydrogens become partially positive. Notice this is polar, so kind of opposite charges, negative and positive. Think of it as north and south poles. All right? Now, those are covalent and then the two types. This then brings us to what a hydrogen bond is. A hydrogen bond is when you have two polar molecules, such as two water molecules, that get attracted to one another. So notice here's a water molecule. This big red sphere represents oxygen. The two little blue spheres represent hydrogen. Hydrogen, they show a partial positive. And then now we have an attraction between the partial positive of this hydrogen in this water molecule and the negative, partial negative charge in the oxygen of a different molecule. That attraction is called a hydrogen bond. And it's very weak. Hydrogen bonds are the weakest, all right, because those bonds form and break all the time. If you want to break all the bonds between these water molecules, you boil it, right? Boiling of water converts the water into a gas, all right, by breaking all these hydrogen bonds. All right, if you want to form a lot of hydrogen bonds, you drop the temperature. When that water freezes, it's got as many hydrogen bonds between water molecules it can possibly have. All right, so based on the presence of either nonpolar or polar bonds, we can call the molecule polar or nonpolar. So water is a polar molecule because it has polar covalent bonds, causing it to have these partial charge differences. All right? Nonpolar molecules like hydrogen gas, like lipids, like triglycerides, don't have any polar bonds. They have all nonpolar bonds. All right? So now we just introduced polar versus nonpolar bonds, as well as polar versus nonpolar molecules. All right? This just shows it a little closer. I kind of got ahead of myself, but these are a bunch of water molecules. This is the bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen is a polar bond, polar covalent. The bond between this hydrogen and this oxygen of a different molecule is the hydrogen bond. All right? Very weak bonds. Why are they called hydrogen bonds? Because there's always a hydrogen, all right, playing a role. All right? There's usually a hydrogen in between, either two oxygens or sometimes it's nitrogens, but anyway. All right? Where do we see a lot of hydrogen bonds? Between polar molecules. So if you've got one polar molecule and another polar molecule, they're going to form that little bit of an attraction to one another. Now, if you have a molecule that's nonpolar, it's not going to be able to form any of these hydrogen bonds. So it's not really going to want to be in water. So that's why nonpolar molecules, because they can't form hydrogen bonds with water, they are hydrophobic. All right? If you can form hydrogen bonds with water, then you are hydrophilic. All right? Okay, let me just go back here, make sure we covered everything. Oh, where else do you see hydrogen bonds? DNA. So to hold the two strands of DNA together, we'll talk more about DNA, but it has two strands that are held together. Those are hydrogen bonds. Okay? So we just introduced the three bonds. We've spent a lot of time on covalent bonds, polar and nonpolar. That led us into learning about hydrogen bonds because you got to have polar bonds in a molecule before it can form hydrogen bonds with another polar molecule. And don't forget, we just introduced hydrophilic. So if you're hydrophilic, you like water because you're polar and water is polar. Hydrophobic are nonpolar molecules because they cannot form hydrogen bonds with water. Okay, so that was a big one. There wasn't any spot to stop until now. So now we're gonna, end this video, let that sink in a little bit. Next video, we're gonna start to talk about other topics such as pH.